The addiction to pressure. Rome did not remove choice entirely. It narrowed it. It wrapped choice in layers of expectation, tradition, and consequence, until choosing felt less like freedom and more like risk management. You could choose, but only between approved options, only at approved times, only in approved ways. This made life feel stable, but it also trained people to associate choice with danger. Because if something went wrong, the question was never, what failed? It was, why did you choose that? Freedom changes this equation abruptly. Suddenly, no one assigns priorities. No one hands you a sequence. No one tells you which path is sensible, which is reckless, which is respectable. You are asked quietly, relentlessly, to decide. And this is where anxiety enters. Not because choice is bad, but because choice without protection feels exposed. Rome provided protection through authority. If you followed orders, mistakes belonged upward. If you chose independently, mistakes belonged to you. So Rome trained people to avoid unnecessary choosing. Better to wait, better to defer, better to ask permission. Freedom removes permission. And without permission, every decision feels heavier. People describe this as overthinking. But it is not excessive thinking. It is unbuffered responsibility. Responsibility without hierarchy. Responsibility without shared blame. Rome distributed responsibility strategically, downward. People carried consequences without carrying power. Freedom flips this. Power returns first. Responsibility follows. But the nervous system remembers the old imbalance. So choosing feels unsafe. People hesitate. They delay. They look for signs. They ask others what they should want, not because they lack intelligence, but because they were trained to treat independent desire as suspicious. Rome never trusted personal preference. Preference disrupts uniformity. Uniformity enables control. So preference was subordinated to duty. Freedom restores preference before it restores confidence. So people feel anxious. They ask, what if I choose wrong? What if I regret this? What if this reveals something bad about me? These questions were once answered externally. Rome told you what was right and what was honorable, what was acceptable. Freedom offers no such reassurance. So anxiety fills the gap, not because freedom is cruel, but because it is honest. Choosing for yourself means owning uncertainty. Rome avoided uncertainty. It replaced it with ritual, with tradition, with precedent. If something had been done before, it was safe to repeat. Freedom breaks precedent. It allows novelty. And novelty feels dangerous to a system trained for repetition. People fear choosing, not because they dislike autonomy, but because autonomy exposes preference. Preference reveals values. Values reveal identity. And identity without institutional backing feels fragile. Rome supported identity structurally, citizen, rank, role. Freedom strips those supports temporarily. You must feel your way forward. Feeling your way forward is not logical. It is experiential. Rome distrusted experience. Experience cannot be standardized, so it trained people to distrust their own impulses. Freedom asks you to listen to them. This listening is awkward, unreliable, often contradictory. People fear making irreversible choices. They imagine futures collapsing. They catastrophize. But beneath the catastrophizing is a deeper fear. If I choose freely and fail, there is no one else to blame. Rome ensured blame was always shared, diffused, or redirected. Freedom concentrates it. At least initially, this concentration feels suffocating. So people freeze. They wait for clarity that never comes. They say, I'll decide when I'm ready. But readiness is a myth. Rome quietly promoted. Readiness suggests permission. Freedom does not grant permission. It allows action before certainty. This feels reckless to a mind trained for approval. So anxiety persists. People mistake it for a sign. They are choosing wrong. But anxiety is not guidance. It is residue of a system that punished deviation, residue of consequences, disproportionately assigned, residue of surveillance, internalized. Rome did not just watch behavior, it watched outcomes, and it punished failure harshly. So failure became terrifying. Freedom does not erase fear of failure. It removes the authority that once justified it. So fear becomes personal. Choosing for yourself means choosing without guarantees. Rome never offered guarantees either. It offered structure. Structure disguised uncertainty. Freedom removes the disguise. So uncertainty becomes visible. Visible uncertainty feels unbearable at first. People want rules again. They crave constraints. They ask for frameworks, not because frameworks are evil, but because they feel familiar. Rome thrived on familiarity. Freedom thrives on tolerance. Tolerance for ambiguity. Tolerance for partial information. Tolerance for imperfect decisions. These tolerances are learned slowly. At first, anxiety dominates, that the body tightens, the mind loops. The future feels threatening, but over time something shifts. Small choices are made. Nothing collapses, mistakes happen. They are survived. Regret appears, but it is not fatal. This survival teaches something Rome never allowed. That failure without punishment is possible. That missteps do not require condemnation. That choosing poorly does not define character. This learning takes repetition and patience. Rome never rewarded patience with oneself. It rewarded compliance. Freedom rewards experimentation, but experimentation requires emotional safety. That safety is not given. It is discovered gradually through choosing anyway, through tolerating discomfort, through realizing that anxiety does not predict disaster. Rome trained people to interpret anxiety as warning. Freedom reframes it as adjustment. Adjustment feels messy. It lacks ceremony, it lacks validation, but it is real. Choosing for yourself does not feel empowering at first, and it feels destabilizing, like walking without a railing. But railings were not freedom. They were constraint disguised as support. Freedom removes them. So balance must be relearned. Wobbling is part of that learning. Rome labeled wobbling as weakness. Freedom reframes it as practice. This reframing is subtle and slow. At first, people still judge themselves harshly. They hear old voices. They replay old standards.
But gradually, new criteria emerge.
Not better or worse, but truer or not. Not approved or disapproved, but aligned or forced. These criteria are quiet. They do not shout. They do not demand. They wait to be noticed. Choosing for yourself. It's not about confidence. Confidence comes later. It is about willingness to act without certainty. Rome avoided this state because uncertainty weakens centralized control. Freedom lives inside it. And anxiety, persistent, uncomfortable, unresolved, is simply the nervous system. Learning that no authority will rescue it from choice anymore. That realization is frightening, but it is also the beginning of something Rome never taught: self-trust. That does not rely on permission. Relearning desire. Rome trained people to wait for approval, not always formally, not always explicitly. Sometimes approval came as silence, sometimes as routine, sometimes as the absence of punishment. But the lesson was consistent. Do not move until the structure has acknowledged you. Permission was not a courtesy. It was a stabilizer. When you waited for permission, you were safe. If something failed, responsibility moved upward. If something succeeded, recognition flowed downward. This arrangement shaped the nervous system. Action without approval felt reckless. Stillness without instruction felt suspicious. Freedom removes permission, not dramatically, not with announcements. It simply stops arriving. And when permission disappears, people do not rush forward. They pause. They wait for something that does not come. This waiting feels strange. Not because nothing is happening, but because something that used to happen reliably is now absent. There is no signal that says you may proceed, no tone of authority, no subtle nod from the system. Just silence. That silence is heavier than restriction. Restriction tells you where you stand. Silence offers no such orientation. People describe this moment as emptiness, but it is not emptiness, it is unresponded readiness. The body is prepared to act, the mind is alert, but nothing arrives to activate movement. Rome trained readiness carefully. People learned to hold themselves in a state of potential motion, ready to comply, ready to adjust, ready to respond. Freedom interrupts the final step. The command never arrives. So the system stays armed, muscles tense, thoughts loop, energy circulates with nowhere to go. This produces anxiety, not fear of danger, fear of misstep, because permission once absorbed uncertainty. Without permission, uncertainty becomes personal. People worry that acting without approval will expose them. Expose incompetence. Expose irresponsibility. Expose something shameful. Rome linked approval to legitimacy. If you were permitted, you were justified. If you were justified, you were protected. Freedom removes justification. Action becomes naked. People hesitate not because they lack desire, but because desire was never meant to lead. Rome trusted structure more than impulse. Impulse was unpredictable. Structure was reliable. So permission replaced intuition. Freedom reverses this order. But intuition is quiet. It does not issue commands. It suggests. Suggestions feel weak to a mind trained for instruction, so people ignore them. They wait. They tell themselves they are being patient. But patience implies something is coming, and nothing is. The silence after permission is not temporary. It is the new condition. And this is where discomfort deepens. People begin to doubt themselves. They assume they are missing something. They check messages. They review plans. They ask others, has someone approved this? Is this allowed? Is this the right time? The absence of permission creates a vacuum. Old habits rush to fill it. Self-monitoring increases. Self-criticism intensifies. Self-explanation multiplies. People narrate their actions mentally. They justify steps that no one requested, because justification once ensured safety. Freedom does not require justification. But the body does not know this yet. Rome never taught people how to act without validation. Validation was woven into systems, performance reviews, social cues, hierarchies. Even silence had meaning. Silence meant wait. Freedom breaks that grammar. Silence now means nothing. Nothing is being communicated. Nothing is being evaluated. This creates panic for a system trained to decode signals constantly. People feel invisible. Invisibility feels like erasure, but invisibility is simply absence of surveillance. Rome relied on visibility. Visible behavior is controllable behavior. Permission made behavior visible. Freedom allows behavior to occur without witness. This feels wrong. People fear they are doing something illicit, even when the action is harmless. Resting, thinking, exploring. These were once conditional activities, allowed only after approval. Now they happen freely. But freedom does not feel free at first, and it feels illegal. People carry an internal authority that questions everything. Why are you doing this? Who said you could? Is this appropriate? These questions persist even when there is no system to answer them. The silence after permission amplifies them. Because no external voice overrides them, Rome always provided an override, an official, a rule, a precedent. Freedom removes overrides, so internal voices gain volume. This is not clarity, it is echo. An echo of authority no longer present. Learning to sit inside that echo is uncomfortable. People want to replace permission quickly. They create rules for themselves. They impose schedules. They set strict standards. They invent consequences, not because discipline is required, but because permissionlessness feels unsafe. Rome would recognize this pattern. Self-discipline was always cheaper than enforcement. If people regulate themselves, systems endure effortlessly. Freedom does not erase self-regulation. It reveals it, and revelation feels like confrontation. People realize how deeply permission shaped their movements. They notice hesitation before simple choices. They notice guilt without cause. They notice the urge to ask. This noticing can be painful because it shows how little space existed for spontaneous action. Rome did not value spontaneity. It valued predictability. Freedom restores unpredictability, but unpredictability feels dangerous, so the body resists. The silence after permission becomes unbearable. People seek noise. Noise substitutes authority, news, tasks, content, anything that tells them what to attend to. Attention once followed permission. Now attention must choose. Choosing attention feels risky. What if you focus on the wrong thing? What if you waste time? What if this does not matter? Rome defined what mattered. Freedom does not. This absence of definition feels like abandonment. But it is not abandonment. It is responsibility, returning to its origin. Responsibility to decide what deserves attention. Rome removed that responsibility deliberately. It made life efficient. But efficiency is not freedom. Freedom tolerates inefficiency. Silence is inefficient. It produces nothing immediately, so it feels suspicious. People assume they should fill it, but filling it prevents adaptation. The nervous system needs time to recalibrate, time without permission, time without evaluation, time without expectation. This recalibration feels like restlessness. But it is learning. Learning that nothing happens when no one approves. Learning that action does not require authorization. Learning that silence is not accusation. Rome taught people that silence meant wait. Freedom teaches that silence means nothing at all, just space. Space to notice, space to feel, space to move when movement arises. Not because it is allowed, but because it is felt. This transition is slow. People often mistake slowness for failure. They think they are stuck, but they are simply unlearning. Unlearning reflexes that once kept them safe. The silence after permission is not absence of structure. It is absence of enforcement. Structure still exists, but it is internal, chosen rather than imposed. That choice takes time to emerge. At first, silence feels heavy. Later, it feels neutral. Eventually, it feels generous. But that generosity cannot be rushed. Rome rushed everything. Freedom does not. So the silence remains, not as punishment, but as invitation. An invitation Rome never issued. An invitation to act without being told, to rest without earning, to move without justification, to exist without asking, and learning to accept that invitation quietly, without ceremony, is one of the hardest transitions a trained mind will ever make, because nothing announces success, nothing confirms progress. There is no permission granted at the end, only a gradual realization that the silence was never withholding approval. It was simply no longer giving orders. When nothing is watching. Rome never asked people to trust themselves. It asked them to trust systems, to trust hierarchy, to trust continuity. Self-trust was unnecessary, even dangerous. If people trusted themselves, they might improvise. If they improvised, they might diverge. If they diverged, control would weaken. So Rome relocated trust outward. Truth lived in procedure. Safety lived in obedience. Correctness lived in precedent. Over time, people learned a subtle lesson. If something feels uncertain, defer. If something feels unclear, wait. If something feels risky, seek approval. This made life predictable, but it also hollowed out self-trust. Freedom reverses this slowly, not by declaring independence, but by withdrawing instruction. Suddenly, there is no authority to consult, no system to defer to, no external voice to absorb doubt. And this is where discomfort sharpens, because trusting yourself feels irresponsible to a mind trained to outsource certainty. People hesitate not because they lack judgment, but because judgment was never meant to belong to them. Rome trained people to interpret internal signals as unreliable. Desire was suspicious, curiosity was undisciplined, intuition was unsafe. So self-trust was replaced with compliance. Freedom removes compliance first. Self-trust does not immediately appear in its place. There is a gap, a long one. Inside that gap, people feel anxious. They ask themselves questions they were never taught how to answer. What do I actually want? What feels right? What matters to me when no one is watching? These questions feel invasive because answering them exposes preference. Preference creates vulnerability. If you choose based on preference and fail, there is no structure to blame. Rome ensured blame always had a destination. Self-trust removes that buffer. So trusting yourself feels risky. Not emotionally, existentially. People fear that self-trust will lead them astray, that they will choose badly, that they will waste time, that they will reveal something flawed. This fear is not irrational. It is learned. Rome punished deviation harshly. Even small misjudgments could carry consequences. So caution became virtue. Hesitation became wisdom. Deferral became responsibility. Freedom dismantles these associations. But the nervous system does not update instantly. It still associates trust with danger. So when freedom asks you to trust yourself, your body resists. You feel tension, restlessness, a low-grade panic. You assume this panic means something is wrong, But it does not. It means you are standing without precedent. Rome always provided precedent. Someone else had done it before. Someone else had approved it. Someone else had validated it. Self-trust has no precedent. It is immediate, personal, unverifiable. That makes it frightening. People look for reassurance. They ask others what they think. They read. They compare. Not because guidance is bad, but because guidance feels safer than listening inward. Rome taught people that inward listening was unreliable. Freedom reopens that channel, but reopening feels noisy at first. Conflicting impulses surface. Old conditioning clashes with new curiosity. People feel torn. They describe this as confusion, but it is recalibration, a system learning to generate direction internally. After centuries of external sourcing, this recalibration feels clumsy. People misinterpret intuition. They second-guess themselves. They oscillate between action and doubt. Rome would label this instability. Freedom calls it learning. Self-trust is not confidence. Confidence implies certainty. Self-trust is tolerance. Tolerance for acting without certainty. Rome avoided this state. It preferred certainty even when false. Self-trust accepts ambiguity. That acceptance is uncomfortable because ambiguity cannot be defended. There is no explanation that satisfies authority, only alignment that satisfies experience. But experience does not speak loudly. It whispers. Rome trained people to ignore whispers, to listen only to commands. So trusting whispers feels foolish. People dismiss them. They say, "This is not practical. This is irresponsible. This is unrealistic." These phrases echo Rome's logic. They prioritize order over truth. Freedom does not argue. It waits. It allows consequences to teach. This is slow, and slowness feels inefficient. Rome optimized everything. Self-trust resists optimization. It grows through repetition, small decisions, small risks, small survivals. You trust yourself a little, nothing collapses. You trust yourself again. Still, nothing collapses. This gradual confirmation is subtle. Rome relied on dramatic reinforcement. Rewards, punishments, clear outcomes. Self-trust offers none of that. It offers continuity, a quiet sense that you can recover, that mistakes are survivable, that misjudgment is not moral failure. Rome never allowed this conclusion. Failure had to hurt, otherwise obedience weakened. Freedom reframes failure not as evidence of defect, but as information. This reframing takes time. People resist it. They cling to harsh self-judgment because it feels familiar. Self-criticism feels safer than self-trust. Criticism maintains control. Trust releases it. So people sabotage themselves. They doubt their instincts. They delay decisions. They retreat to structure. Rome depended on this reflex. It ensured people never wandered too far. Freedom allows wandering, but wandering feels reckless because no one is supervising. Self-trust means accepting that no one will intervene. That realization is terrifying, but it is also clarifying. You begin to see how much of your caution was not wisdom. It was fear of punishment, fear of disapproval, fear of being wrong. Freedom does not remove these fears instantly, it exposes them. Exposure is uncomfortable, but it is necessary because you cannot trust yourself. While punishing yourself for uncertainty, Rome punished uncertainty. Freedom tolerates it. This tolerance is learned, not intellectually, somatically, through lived experience. You act, you survive, you adjust. No one condemns you. Gradually, the body learns. That trust does not equal danger. This learning is fragile at first. One harsh consequence can reactivate old patterns. People revert, they blame themselves, they seek structure again. This is not failure. It is residue of centuries of conditioned obedience. Self-trust is not a switch. It is a muscle. Unused muscles ache when activated. They tremble. They fatigue quickly. Rome never exercised this muscle. Freedom does. So discomfort is expected. People often think something is wrong with them because trusting themselves feels so hard. But the difficulty is not personal. It is historical. A system trained to distrust internal authority does not reverse easily, but it can, slowly, quietly, without declaration. Each time you listen inward, and nothing disastrous happens, self-trust gains a fraction of ground. Rome loses a fraction of influence, not through rebellion, through repetition. Self-trust does not announce itself. It does not feel heroic. It feels tentative. It feels cautious. It feels imperfect. But over time, something shifts. You begin to act without seeking permission. You begin to rest without justification. You begin to choose without over-explaining. These actions feel small, but they represent a profound change. Authority is no longer external. It is experiential, not because you are certain, but because you are willing to remain present with uncertainty. Rome never prepared people for this state, so it feels foreign. But foreign does not mean wrong, it means uninhabited. And inhabiting self-trust is not about mastering it. It is about staying with discomfort long enough for fear to lose its monopoly on decision. That is the quiet work freedom demands. Not confidence, not clarity, but patience. Patience with the unease of finally trusting a voice Rome taught you to doubt. Building a life without permission. Rome made control feel heavy, but it also made it feel shared. If the burden was large, at least it was distributed. If the rules were harsh, at least they were clear. If life was exhausting, at least the exhaustion had a reason. Control gave people something solid to push against. Freedom removes that resistance, and without resistance, effort feels strangely weightless. Weightless does not feel light, it feels unstable. People often expect freedom to lift pressure, but instead it concentrates it, not outward, inward. Under Rome, pressure came from above: orders, expectations, deadlines. Under freedom, pressure comes from inside. What should I do now? What matters enough to deserve my time? What direction is worth choosing? These questions are heavier than commands because commands end responsibility. Questions begin it. Rome understood this instinctively. It knew that too much freedom would exhaust people. Choice drains energy, decision consumes attention. Responsibility wears the nervous system down. So Rome simplified life, not to make it kind, but to make it manageable. Control limited options. Limited options reduced cognitive load. People did not have to decide what mattered. They were told. They did not have to evaluate priorities. They followed them. Freedom removes that simplification. Suddenly everything is optional, and optionality feels overwhelming. People feel tired without doing anything strenuous. They feel burdened even in calm days. They say, I don't know why this feels so heavy. The heaviness is not from effort. It is from authorship. Being the author of your life means you carry the weight of direction. Rome never allowed authorship. It allowed execution. Execution is easier. You perform tasks. You meet requirements. You complete sequences. Freedom offers no sequence. You must invent one. Invention is demanding. It requires imagination, risk tolerance, emotional resilience. Rome discouraged imagination. Imagination questions inevitability. Freedom revives it. But imagination is exhausting. You must hold multiple possibilities at once. You must accept that you will close some paths by choosing others. Under control, paths were closed for you. Under freedom, you close them yourself. This feels like loss. Even when the choice is good, people grieve options they never took. They second guess. They replay alternatives. They fear missing something essential. Rome minimized this fear by minimizing choice. Freedom amplifies it. So people feel heavier, not because they are doing more, but because they are carrying more. Carrying uncertainty, carrying consequence, carrying the knowledge that no one else is deciding. This weight feels unbearable at first. People fantasize about returning to structure. They romanticize simpler systems. They say life was easier then. What they miss is not oppression. It is relief from authorship. Rome provided that relief efficiently, but relief came at a cost. That cost was agency. Freedom restores agency. Agency weighs something. It presses on the chest. It tightens the breath. Because agency makes failure personal. Under control, failure could be blamed. Under freedom, failure must be integrated. Rome externalized failure. Freedom internalizes learning. Learning is slower than punishment, but deeper. Rome preferred fast correction. Punishment taught compliance quickly. Freedom allows mistakes to linger, to teach slowly. This slowness feels inefficient. Inefficiency feels irresponsible. Rome taught people to fear inefficiency. So freedom feels morally wrong at first. People accuse themselves of laziness. They say they lack discipline. They feel ashamed of quiet days. But the shame is not evidence. It is conditioning. Rome equated worth with contribution. Freedom disconnects worth from output. This disconnection creates vertigo. People do not know where to anchor value, so they feel adrift. Adrift feels heavy, not because you are sinking, but because there is no fixed point. Rome offered fixed points everywhere: rank, status, role. Freedom offers none by default. You must create them. Creation takes effort, and effort without validation feels endless. Under control, effort ended with approval. Under freedom, effort has no clear endpoint. You stop when you decide to stop. That decision carries weight. Because no one absolves you, no one says enough. You must feel it. Feeling when something is enough is not taught. Rome avoided teaching it. Enough disrupts accumulation. Freedom requires enough. Enough is subtle. It cannot be measured easily. So people overshoot. They exhaust themselves. They recreate pressure. They say freedom is tiring. But it is not freedom itself. It is unfamiliar responsibility. Rome trained people to be strong under pressure. It did not train them to be gentle with choice. Freedom demands gentleness. Gentleness is not weakness, but Rome framed it that way. Gentleness slows momentum. Freedom slows momentum. Slow feels heavy to those trained for speed. Rome accelerated life intentionally. Movement prevented reflection. Freedom decelerates. Deceleration feels like resistance. Resistance feels like weight. People want acceleration back. They want something to push against. They miss deadlines. They miss urgency. They miss being needed. Need provided purpose. Freedom provides possibility. Possibility feels abstract. Need felt concrete. So freedom feels heavier, not because it is oppressive, but because it removes necessity. Necessity simplifies, possibility complicates. Rome preferred simplicity. Freedom embraces complexity. Complexity demands patience. Patience is not rewarded immediately. So people struggle. They think something is wrong with them and they assume they are not built for freedom. But the difficulty is not personal, it is transitional. A system trained for command does not adapt instantly to choice. The nervous system resists. It seeks familiar pressure, better known pain than unknown space. Rome relied on this preference. It kept systems stable. Freedom destabilizes first, then reorganizes, but destabilization feels like failure. People interpret heaviness as evidence that freedom is overrated. But heaviness is not collapse. It is load shifting. The weight that once sat on structures now rests on awareness. Awareness is tiring at first. You notice more, you feel more. You cannot hide behind routine. Rome insulated people from awareness. Freedom exposes it. Exposure feels intense, but intensity does not last forever. Over time, the body adapts. The weight redistributes. You stop carrying every possibility consciously. You learn to let some pass. You accept that you cannot choose everything perfectly. Rome demanded perfection through obedience. Freedom allows imperfection through choice. This allowance is liberating, but only after it is tolerated. At first, freedom feels heavier. Later, it feels quieter. Eventually, it feels spacious. But the transition is real, and pretending otherwise only deepens confusion. Rome never taught people how to carry freedom, so it feels awkward, like wearing unfamiliar weight. But that weight is not meant to crush. It is meant to be balanced. And balance takes practice. Practice takes time. Rome never offered time. Freedom does. Quietly, without instructions, without reassurance, just space. And space feels heavy until you learn how to stand inside it without leaning on control. The patience freedom requires. Rome did not disappear suddenly. It faded unevenly. Old habits lingered long after. Authority weakened. Old reflexes survived long after orders stopped. People carried the empire inside themselves, even when its structures no longer stood. Freedom works the same way. It does not arrive as a transformation. It arrives as an interval, an in-between state. You are no longer controlled, but you are not yet oriented. This interval feels uncomfortable. People want closure. They want a new identity quickly. They want to replace the old structure with something equally solid. But freedom does not provide immediate solidity. It allows something slower to happen. The gradual emergence of a different self. Not a stronger self, and not a more confident self, not a perfected self, a quieter one. Rome valued clarity, clear roles, clear ranks, clear expectations. Freedom introduces ambiguity, and ambiguity dissolves sharp edges. The self that emerges here is less defined, less dramatic, less certain, which is why it is often overlooked. People expect change to feel obvious, but this change is subtle. It appears as a reduction, less urgency, less self-explanation, less performance. You notice it not by what appears, but by what stops happening. You stop rehearsing conversations that never occur. You stop defending choices no one questioned. You stop narrating your worth internally. This absence feels strange. Rome trained people to maintain constant internal dialogue, assessment, correction, justification. Freedom interrupts this dialogue. At first, the silence feels empty. Later, it feels neutral. Eventually, it feels spacious. But spaciousness is not exhilarating. It is calm. And calm can feel anticlimactic to a mind trained for intensity. Rome thrived on intensity. Intensity keeps attention focused. It prevents drifting. It discourages reflection. Freedom allows drifting, and drifting allows reorientation. This reorientation is not intentional. You do not decide to become different. You simply stop forcing sameness. The self that emerges is less concerned with appearing correct, because correctness belonged to systems. Freedom does not reward correctness. It tolerates approximation. You make choices without needing them to be optimal. You accept that some days will be unremarkable. Rome taught people that unremarkable meant useless. Freedom reveals that unremarkable can be sufficient. This realization does not arrive as insight. It arrives as relief. Relief that nothing bad happens. When you do less, relief that identity does not collapse. Without constant reinforcement, Rome maintained identity through repetition. Freedom allows identity to breathe. Breathing is subtle. It is not noticed unless it stops. Likewise, the new self is noticed only when the old tension fades. You realize you are less afraid of pauses. You notice you do not rush to fill silence. You find yourself choosing without apology. These changes are small, but they accumulate. Rome depended on accumulation. So does freedom. But the direction is reversed. Instead of accumulating obligation, you accumulate tolerance. Tolerance for uncertainty, tolerance for imperfection, tolerance for not knowing. This tolerance reshapes identity quietly. The self that emerges does not need constant validation, not because it is confident, but because it is less dependent. Rome trained dependency thoroughly on rules, on approval, on hierarchy. Freedom withdraws these supports gradually, and in their absence, something unexpected happens. You begin to notice your own rhythms when you are tired, when you are curious, when something feels complete. Rome ignored rhythm. It imposed cadence. Freedom allows rhythm to return. Rhythm cannot be optimized. It must be followed. Following rhythm feels irresponsible at first, but responsibility has shifted. It is no longer about compliance. It is about attention. Attention to what feels sustainable. Attention to what feels draining. Attention to what feels alive. Without being impressive, this attentiveness forms a different kind of self. A self that does not rush to explain itself. A self that does not need to be seen constantly. A self that tolerates invisibility. Rome equated invisibility with insignificance. Freedom reveals that invisibility can be restful. The emerging self does not announce its presence. It does not seek audience. It exists comfortably without measurement. This comfort takes time. At first, invisibility feels like loss. Later, it feels like privacy. Privacy was rare under Rome. Life was always observable. Freedom restores inner privacy, not secrecy, privacy. a space where thoughts do not need to perform, where feelings do not need to be managed immediately, where silence does not demand interpretation. This privacy allows something else to grow, not ambition, not drive, but discernment. Discernment is quiet. It does not push, it filters. You begin to notice what does not belong, obligations that no longer resonate, pressures that feel inherited, standards that no longer apply. You release them slowly, without rebellion, without announcement. Rome feared this process. Because it cannot be controlled, it happens internally, quietly. Over time, the self that emerges here is not heroic. It is not impressive. It is not optimized. It is resilient in a different way. Resilient because it does not depend on constant reinforcement. Resilient because it can tolerate emptiness without panic. Resilient because it does not confuse stillness with failure. This resilience feels unfamiliar. It lacks drama. It lacks milestones. But it endures. Rome built endurance through pressure. Freedom builds endurance through adaptability. Adaptability is subtle. You notice it when change arrives. And you do not collapse. When uncertainty appears, and you do not rush to escape. When freedom feels heavy, and you do not retreat to control. These moments are quiet. They pass unnoticed, but they mark transformation. The new self does not replace the old one completely. Residue remains. Old reflexes surface under stress. That is normal. Rome was internalized over centuries. Freedom does not erase that overnight. But each time you respond differently, that the balance shifts slightly, gradually, without spectacle. The slow emergence of a different self is not about becoming someone new. It is about shedding what was imposed, layer by layer, expectation by expectation, until what remains feels simpler. Not easier, but simpler, less defended, less performed, more present. Rome trained people to live as roles. Freedom allows people to live as participants, participants in their own experience, not as subjects, not as executors, but as witnesses. Witnessing does not demand control. It allows observation. Observation creates distance. Distance creates choice. Choice, exercised gently, reshapes identity. Over time, the self that emerges does not fear freedom as loss. It recognizes it as space. Space to adjust, space to recover, space to be incomplete. This recognition does not arrive suddenly. It grows quietly. And one day, without announcement, you realize something has changed. You are still uncertain, still imperfect, still unfinished, but you are no longer waiting for someone to tell you who you are supposed to be. That waiting has dissolved, not into certainty, into permission, permission not granted, but discovered. And Rome, for all its mastery of control, never taught people how to discover that. Peace is not a performance. There is no final lesson here, no instruction to follow, no system to replace the one that faded, no new structure waiting to take command, because freedom does not conclude with clarity. It concludes with quiet, a quiet that does not demand, a quiet that does not evaluate, a quiet that does not rush you toward improvement. Rome never trusted this quiet. Silence without direction looked like decay to an empire built on motion. Stillness without command looked like threat. So people were trained to fear moments when nothing was being asked of them. That fear lingers, even now, even here. When the orders stop, the body expects the next one. When no one is watching, the mind assumes something is missing. When pressure fades, guilt tries to replace it, not because you are broken, but because this is unfamiliar territory. Freedom does not feel like triumph. It feels like standing in a room where the machinery has shut off and your ears are still ringing. At first, you want the noise back, not because it was kind, but because it was predictable. Rome offered predictability at the cost of self-contact. Freedom removes that cost, but it does not immediately replace what was lost. It leaves space, and space is uncomfortable when you were trained to be occupied. You may still feel restless, you may still feel unsure, you may still look for something to justify your presence. That does not mean you are failing. It means the old reflexes are loosening. There is no test at the end of this process. No moment where someone declares you free, no certificate, no approval, because freedom was never something granted. It was something withheld. And now quietly, it is no longer being withheld. Nothing is asking you to hurry. Nothing is asking you to prove. Nothing is asking you to perform. You may still ask yourself those things. That is habit. Habits fade slowly. Rome took centuries to build them. They do not dissolve in a single season. So be patient with the slowness. Be patient with the discomfort. Be patient with the moments where freedom feels empty or heavy or strangely anticlimactic. Those moments are not errors. They are pauses. Pauses Rome never allowed. In these pauses, something different becomes possible. Not productivity, not optimization, not self-correction, but presence. Presence without justification. Presence without urgency. Presence without explanation. You are not required to fill the silence. You are not required to know what comes next. You are not required to turn freedom into purpose immediately. The empire taught people that unused space was waste. It was wrong. Space is where recalibration happens, where the nervous system learns that nothing collapses, when nothing is demanded, where the self learns. That worth does not evaporate. When it is not measured, where life begins to feel quieter, not because it is empty, but because it is no longer being shouted at. There is no finish line here, only a gradual easing, a softening of internal commands, a reduction in the need to explain yourself to an audience that is no longer present. One day, without realizing it, you stop waiting. Not because you found certainty, but because the waiting itself lost meaning. And in that moment, freedom does not announce itself. It does not arrive with confidence. It simply feels ordinary, unremarkable, available. Rome never feared rebellion as much as it feared this. People who can tolerate silence do not need constant direction. People who can sit without instruction cannot be easily rushed. People who do not panic when nothing is asking them anything are difficult to control. This is not a call to resist. It is not a call to change. It is simply an invitation to notice what happens when nothing is being asked of you, to remain there without fixing it, without explaining it, without turning it into something useful, just long enough for the old noise to fade. And when it does, what remains will not be dramatic. It will not feel revolutionary. It will feel quieter than you expected. But that quiet is not absence. It is space. And space is where freedom actually lives.